Hello, welcome. This is Think for Yourself, an introduction to critical thinking. My name is Mark Thorsby, and we're following a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. We hope you'll follow along. So welcome back, everyone. As you know, that this video series is a series on critical thinking. We've organized it our book does, according to basic rules that we think that if we can follow these rules, we can improve our ability to both analyze and make good, solid arguments. We looked at a number of different things over the course of the past couple weeks, or at least through the video series. Everything from analogies, generalizations, being concrete and concise, and so on and so forth. We've even looked at different types of informal and formal fallacies. In this week's video, we're going to be taking a look at sources. And in particular, we'll be following chapter 4. And unlike some of our previous videos, we're going to be looking at 5 different rules for reasoning, all that have to do with sources and citations. Now, most of you probably are already aware that we have a basic academic and scholarship convention, which is namely that one should always cite their sources in an argument. And the reason is pretty straightforward. Namely, there's no person really in the world who is credible, and there are a lot of people who know a lot of things, but there's no one who's credible enough to know everything. And what this means that when we make arguments, frequently what we have to do is we depend upon other people who are experts or other people who do know the arguments better than we, and we use their claims as evidence in our papers or in our own arguments. So you can see here that if you looked at an argument, every argument, right, is going to have a conclusion, and the conclusion is the claim, but the claim is always supported by a premise or evidence of some sort. Now, I really think there's 2 different types of evidence we can talk about. Well, the one is what I would call internal evidence. So imagine, for instance, you're writing a paper, and you make your own argument about you make your own argument, you provide your own evidence for whatever claim you're making. This would be internal. This means that internal to the argument that you're writing itself is the evidence for the claim you're making. But a lot of times this isn't really possible for most of us, and it depends on the subject matter in particular. So as opposed to internal evidence, there's also what we might call external evidence. That is, we look to others or we look to experts to help us understand or to clarify a concept. Okay? Now, there is, if you will, when you're citing a source, there's a sort of formal analytic structure to the way in which you're making an argument. And it looks something like this. I call this the general argumentative form for a source. Basically, it's something like this. The premise is that X says Y, where X is a source that ought to know, therefore Y is true. Okay, we should immediately note that in your books calls this risky business. Basically, here's why. Because when you make the argument that you should believe that Y is true because X said it, that means that your whole argument, therefore, depends upon X, who X is, and whether or not X is actually right. And notice, for instance, that if you cite a source in this manner, you're saying that this expert argues Y, and therefore we should believe Y. That means that you're also not actually evaluating the reasons that they give. Usually the best way when you're writing your own argument is not only to say that X says Y, but also to lay out the reasons that X gives for saying that Y is actually the case. So you have to be careful here because this is generally the structure of what we call an argument by authority. Every argument by authority is inductive, and if you'll recall from our previous videos, there's 2 forms of reasoning. There's inductive and deductive. Deductive reasoning is reasoning by necessity, and inductive reasoning is reasoning by probability. And that means that when you make an argument from a source, that means that your argument is only at its very best can only probably be true. It's not necessarily true. This is why, for instance, mathematicians don't cite other mathematicians. They actually just give the mathematical proofs so as to avoid this problem of inductive authority. But this is something that we all ultimately do when we cite sources. And so it's important for you to recognize that every time you cite a source, it's actually less, what do I want to say here? I guess rigorously it's less rigorous and less convincing than if you could actually just lay out the arguments. The problem is most of us don't either A, know the original arguments, and so we rely upon authorities, or B, we don't have time to actually lay them out, and so we let our sources do that for us. So I think it's incredibly important to use sources, but you have to recognize that it will always conform to a procedure of inductive reasoning. Okay, let's take a look at the rules in particular. Rule 13 is cite your sources. This one's pretty straightforward. You've probably been, if you're a college student, you've had this drilled into your head, hopefully, for quite a long time now. So the question is, what needs to be cited, and what does it mean to cite a source? Well, when you make a claim, if the claim doesn't come from you, we typically say that you need to cite the source. That is, you need to create a reference so that your reader is able to find out where you got that information, and then they can at least evaluate the authority of that source itself. Similarly, when you're reading or evaluating someone else's argument and they start giving you lots of information, you need to be aware some of that information really should be referenced, whereas some of it doesn't necessarily have to be. So the question is, well, what needs to be cited? Well, the first thing is things that are well known, obvious, or common knowledge are not things that we typically cite, right? So if you say, for instance, that the United States was founded in 1796, or depending on how you want to interpret the founding of the country, whether it's through Articles of Confederacy or the Constitution, right? If you want to say that that's when the country began, you don't need to cite that because everyone knows that. At least most everyone in America knows that. You don't really need to cite the fact that the earth is round. We also generally know that. That's common knowledge. So if it's something that you expect your reader to just know, then you don't really need to cite the source there. Now, when you have precise claims and you have uncommon knowledge, you have published information that can only be derived from research, that type of information does need to be cited. This should say yes. I just realized now there's a mistake there. But anything that's precise or common knowledge, published information, anything specialized really does need to be cited. And there's a number of different ways that you can cite these. It's also important to remember that it's not just quotes or paraphrases that get citations, but sometimes the use of the information itself. So for instance, if you cite a statistic, you should really include a source for that, even if you're not giving a quotation or a paraphrase. Now, the question here is, why should you cite sources? Why does it matter? Well, I think there's a number of different reasons. One is the credibility of your argument itself or the argument that you're evaluating. The more an argument is cited, typically the greater the credibility that argument will have, simply because that means that an argument is actually representative of the current state of research, right? It's also important for the clarity, so people understand where your information is coming from, or where the information is coming from, as well as so that they know why you're arguing what you're arguing and what your baseline of research is coming from. Another really important reason to cite your sources is research scholarship. Now, let me explain this one. In fact, I think this is the most important, and it's namely this. Is one of the reasons we cite our sources is so that we can continue to do research later on. It's a part of the standards of scholarship, essentially across all academia, that people reference previous works in order to develop a more robust, legitimate argument. So you think about this: when you write a paper. Oftentimes we're told that the reason you cite your sources is so that we know that you're not plagiarizing your paper. That's certainly important, right? Obviously we want to avoid plagiarism and we want to give due credit where credit is deserved. But another, I think, really more important reason is so that way someone who's reading your paper, or if you're reading someone else's paper, if you have questions, you have somewhere to go. You have a lead, a trail of breadcrumbs that you can follow to learn more about the subject that you're studying. So research scholarship is really, really a key and important reason, and it helps create a community of reputable scholarship. Now, there's a number of different citation styles, and this class is not on citation style, so I'm not going to talk about this much. But Chicago manual style is the style we're using for our papers in this class. It's commonly used in the humanities. But other style citation systems that people are probably broadly familiar with are the MLA, the Modern Language Association citation style, or the APA, the American Psychological Association style guide. And there's actually many others. Oxford has their own, Harvard has their own, and there's a whole bunch of them, in fact. Usually in the United States, it's one of these three that are used, though that's not always the case. I'm not going to take a look at those, but what I will encourage you to take a look at is this web link here. In fact, let me pull this over for you. You can see here, if you go to Purdue University has something called the Purdue OWL, which is their online writing lab, but they have a really quick, easy citation style guide that you can take a look at. So for instance, you can go, if you research and citation, you can click on Chicago Manual, for instance, and you can learn all about how the manual system works. Introduction, you can see, for instance, this is the kind of ways in which you would cite a source with a bibliography entry. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but you can take a look at the Purdue OWL, which I think is actually a helpful video guide for most students. It doesn't replace the actual manual, and so you'll probably at some point want to get a manual, depending on what your major of interest is. If you're going into philosophy, probably Chicago. If you're going into literature, probably MLA. If you're going into the sciences, probably APA. Okay, so that's a little bit about citation. So you want to make sure to cite your sources. Now, Rule 14 is about this type of sources that you look for. And I'm primarily thinking here about you as being a writer, but of course all of this applies to your evaluation of other people's writing, okay? So 14, seek informed sources. Now, I'm just going to run through a couple bullet points here that I think are helpful. Number one, sources need to be qualified to make the statements that they make, right? When I say sources need to be qualified, really what I'm talking about is the authors or the writers who make statements need to be qualified. Now here you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to have a qualification in a particular source? Remember, all of this is inductive. So just because someone's not qualified doesn't mean they're wrong. And just because someone is qualified doesn't mean they're right. So qualification only gives you evidence or support for the probability of a correct statement, right? So a source should have knowledge and credibility in the requisite field of investigation. So for instance, if you're looking at political sources, actors are not good sources, right? For instance, if you hear an actor giving a campaign commercial, not a very good source. For instance, put it this way, a creationist is usually not a good source for evolutionary biology, right? For instance, a physicist is not necessarily a good source for making ethical or philosophical arguments. They may be good at it, they may not be. In fact, a good example of this actually came from, most people are pretty aware of Bill Nye the Science Guy. Not too long ago, if you go on YouTube, you can watch this. Bill Nye gave a short little video clip on philosophy, and he got a whole bunch of things wrong about philosophy, and the philosophical world had a collective cringe when he posted that video. But here's the problem, is that Bill Nye is a pretty reputable source for scientific information and scientific education. But Bill Nye is not a very good source for philosophical investigation, right? So, but a lot of times, people who are qualified in one area will make claims in another area that they're not qualified in. So when we talk about qualification, we're really talking about the requisite field of investigation. And here you can ask yourself, for instance, does this person have a degree? How do they have a history of writing and discussing these issues? Or is this just a side comment that they made at a conference, right? So you need to make sure that your sources are qualified to make the statements that they make. And qualification can mean a number of different things. Number two, where a source's qualifications are unclear, an argument should explain their relevance. So this is an important feature. Sometimes it is unclear whether or not someone really is qualified. And so basically what we're arguing here is this rule of reasoning is that a paper, an argument should be upfront about the potential lack of qualifications for a citation. So tell your reader, or if you're reading, the author should explain to you the relevance of a source if it's not immediately obvious, right? So for instance, if someone cites Stephen Hawking on a paper they're writing about black holes, it's obvious that Stephen Hawking is a credible source. If someone is writing a paper about the metaphysics of God's existence and they quote Stephen Hawking, they should explain how he's a relevant source here. And he may very well be. So it's important to also recognize that an informed source is not necessarily an authority. Remember, an authority here refers to someone who has an established position within their requisite field. But just to be an informed source, you don't necessarily have to be an authority. For instance, imagine if you wanted to find out if a college you were transferring to was a very good college, right? You could contact the authorities at the college, right? The administrators and the faculty. But you'd also want to consult other types of sources. For instance, students who are there. They're not authorities, but their information would be highly important. And they would certainly be an informed source. So remember that just because we're talking about sources doesn't mean you have to have an authority per se, okay? But most of the time you will probably use an authority when you cite something. So authorities on one subject are not necessarily informed about every subject on which they offer opinions. That is, remember, just because someone's an authority doesn't necessarily mean that all of their opinions are relevant. So one of the things that you'll have to do as a writer and as a reader is learn to differentiate what's relevant that an authority says and what's irrelevant. Okay, and that's usually determined by the type of argument that you're making. Number 5, sometimes we must rely on sources whose knowledge is limited, right? Sometimes we have a source for a claim, but the source itself admits that there's limited knowledge on a particular topic. Now, when that happens, what you need to do is you need to acknowledge the limitation of a source, or an argument should acknowledge that limitation, and not treat a source as being the absolute end-all for a topic when the author doesn't even think that themselves, right? So that's something that's really important when you go through and you're using a source or someone quotes a source. If the original source is skeptical, then that means you should treat their claims as skeptical as well, okay? Let's move here to the next one. So seek informed sources. Now the next one here is not only should the sources be informed, but the sources should be impartial, okay? Now what does impartial mean? I've given my own sort of definition here. Impartial here, I think refers to the equal consideration of evidence. The Oxford English Dictionary actually defines impartial as treating all rivals or disputants equally, fair, and just. So that means impartiality means that a source should not be overtly biased towards a certain understanding of the thing they're talking about, right? And there's two types of forms of impartiality that we can mention. On the one hand is what is called epistemic impartiality. Epistemology refers to knowledge, or your theory of knowledge. So epistemic impartiality refers to the impartiality of the way in which one thinks they know something, right? And this means that usually, in order to establish the epistemic impartiality, you usually have to be able to articulate or at least identify the methodology that an author is using in order to make a claim. That is, what is the method of reasoning they're employing? And is that method of reasoning partial or is it impartial? That is it already driven by a loaded presumption or assumption about the thing that's being investigated. Now, epistemic impartiality can also be differentiated, philosophers argue, from moral impartiality. Moral impartiality. That is, you can evaluate someone's claims in terms of whether that claim is true or not. That's epistemic impartiality. But some claims we can be morally partial to. We can disagree morally with something. And this is important because it's not always the case that you should be morally impartial. You should be morally impartial, But sometimes, for instance, you're not impartiality, your epistemic impartiality doesn't mean is not necessarily related to your moral impartiality, right? So, for instance, if someone makes the argument that you should, treat people of differing races differently, right? Maybe they'll even give you arguments, right? But there's a moral problem with that. And so just because you can evaluate a source based upon how its knowledgeability, there may actually be moral problems with it. Now, you should be morally impartial. That is, you should evaluate and treat everyone equally. But some positions are going to be morally reprehensible. I mean, so you have to be clear about what that is. Usually this only occurs in sort of ethics, cases of ethics and whatnot, right? So what are some of the things you can do in order to assess the impartiality of a source? Number one, look for impartial sources. In other words, you want to look for people or organizations who do not have a stake in the immediate issue and who have a prior or a primary interest in accuracy, such as some university scientists or statistical databases. So there's a quote from the book on page 92. Basically what we're talking about here is take a look at if someone has a stake economically or personally in the outcome of a specific argument, they're not usually a very good source, or they're not usually an impartial source. So for instance, if you are going to write a paper about say for instance the effects of redistributions on the political landscape in the United States, right? A bad source would be to go to a think tank that's just from Republicans, or a think tank that's just from Democrats, because they're obviously partial, right? And you also want to make sure that wherever your source is, their primary interest is the accuracy of what they're talking about, not the persuasion of the argument itself. Okay, that's really, really important. Also, you need to consider potential conflicts of interest from a source. Evaluate the methodology of the source, right? How did they come to make the claims they make? Extreme or simplistic claims are almost always suspicious. You should be suspicious of. So when someone argues that anything that's really simple or really extreme, usually it's a sign that they are not an impartial source or not a credible source. That's not always the case, but frequently it is. Number 5, confirm factual claims from potentially biased sources. So for instance, imagine you're in a political philosophy class and you're writing a paper on let's see here, gerrymandering and the redistricting of Congress or something like this. Let's say you do find a think tank who does cite a source, they cite a statistic. If that source comes from a potentially biased source, you want to confirm that factual claim by looking to see if other sources have the same information. If they don't, it's usually a bad idea to use that argument. One more thing here. For instance, once you complete the exercise, you're going to see something like this. So for instance, here's a claim, and can you think of an impartial source? Imagine someone makes this argument. Because an abortion is a medically dangerous procedure, doctors administering these procedures should have hospital admitting privileges in the event of a dangerous complication. Now, I pulled this actually because Texas, for instance, has introduced local state law that requires all doctors who administer abortions to have hospital emergency room privileges, which means that they can go and they can work in the emergency room, they can admit people from their office. Now, this is very rare. In fact, most states don't require this. But if someone made this argument or made this claim, it's likely that it sounds like it makes sense. The thing, though, is, does this come from an impartial source? And so you'd have to ask yourself, what kind of sources here would be impartial about this? For instance, if you go to a pro-life website, this would not be an impartial source, and it's a bad place to go. But if this is something that's, for instance, let's say, on the American Medical Association's website, then suddenly it starts to sound a lot more partial. Or even better, if this has been published in a medical journal as and there's evidence to back it up, then that would be an impartial source for this sort of claim. But if I just got this from a website or from a politician, this would certainly not be an impartial source. And so you'll see that what you're going to have to do in the exercises is essentially try to think of impartial sources for examples like that. Okay, let's move to Rule 16. Rule 16 is that you should need to cross-check your sources. And this mainly means that when you have a lot of sources, which maybe some of them are better than others, some are more credible than others, some are more clear than others, one of the things you're going to want to do is to make sure that your sources are in somewhat agreement, right? So number one, you want to consult and compare a variety of sources to see if other equally good sources, authorities agree. In the United States, especially within the scientific community, but this is also true in the humanities as well, is that one of the primary elements of sound scholarship concerns whether or not something is peer-reviewed. That is, whether or not other people who are also experts in the same field are in general agreement. Where there's more general agreement, obviously, we tend to take those claims as being more credible. Where there's less agreement, we take those claims as less credible. Right? So you want to consult and compare a variety of sources to see if they agree or if there's lots of disagreement about the subject you're talking about. Where experts disagree, it's probably wise to reserve your own judgment in the paper, or the author should tread carefully. So because if you use a source and a source, the source itself is a little bit nervous about the claim, or they make a lot of provisional statements and qualifications about their claims, then it's important that those qualifications be delineated in the new argument that's citing it, right? So that brings me to point 3 here. Don't overstate the certainty of a claim if the experts are cautious in their own judgment. So if the experts are cautious, you should be cautious. Okay. Now, disagreement, though, does not necessarily disqualify a source. So just because sources don't agree doesn't mean that it's a bad source. But I think generally what's the best thing to do is you should cite the disagreement. So if you're writing a paper and your sources disagree, you should mention that this is an area of contention within the field of study. Or when you're reading a paper, a good argument should clarify and make that clear. Okay, whoops, I got one more here. Here's one of the exercises that comes from the book to give you a sense. You're going to have to find 2 sources and evaluate this question. So I made up this question. Should young children and infants be exposed to peanuts? Right? So imagine someone asked this question. Ask yourself, what are 2 sources, 2 reputable, solid sources that you would find or could use in order to answer this question? So you'll see in the practice exercises, you're going to have to actually do this, which is a really great exercise. Let's move to the last little circle here. And this is Rule 17. This one most of you know pretty well simply because a lot of professors talk about this. And that's Rule 17, use the web with care. And we're talking here, of course, about the internet. And the internet has so much information on it. It's a tremendous resource. But one of the things that we've noticed over the years is that people tend to have a poor ability to judge the credibility of the sources they find on the internet. For instance, Wikipedia is a good example. A lot of the information on Wikipedia is accurate, but there's also a lot of information that's probably inaccurate, and there's actually been studies to show this. So just because it's on the internet, of course, does not mean that it's necessarily good. So what are the things you want to look at when you're looking on the internet? One is the reliability of the source, the reputability, and the credibility. And you want to know whether or not the source is reliable. So for instance, Wikipedia is not always reliable. Why? Because it changes constantly. Is it reputable? Well, the problem with Wikipedia is there has multiple authors per article, which means that it's difficult to assess the reputability and whether or not it's credible. I think most of what's on Wikipedia is fairly credible, but the problem is people don't actually ask the question of credibility here. And when you're on a Wikipedia article, if you want to assess these things, the absolute best way to do so is to scroll down at the bottom of a Wikipedia page and actually take a look at the bibliography. Let me go ahead and actually show you what that looks like right now. So let me go, let's see here. So imagine, for instance, I go to Wikipedia. right? Go over here to Wikipedia. Let's just pick let's just pick an article. Let's pick an article about David Hume. Is a well-known philosopher. Okay, and you can see here a lot of people, there's a lot of information here about David Hume. Probably most of it's accurate because David Hume is such a well-known person, but not necessarily. Generally speaking, when you go to this website, this stuff's great information, but the real place you want to assess the reputability of all of this is right here at the end, where you can see all of the works of David Hume are cited, but all of the references are given. So you can actually find out where this information is coming from. And the nice thing here is you can click on Fisher and you can actually find out the exact argument. And in this case, it looks like they actually have a PDF of the argument. Let's take a look. Right? And see here, now you can see that this actually comes from the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, which means it is a peer-reviewed source, so it has a high degree of reputability. And of course, you could read this article to learn more. So if you're going to be using Wikipedia and you're using the internet, the best thing to do is to think of yourself as an investigator and try to look and find out where these sources are coming from. And if you can find peer-reviewed sources, that usually means that they're reliable. Now you can assess their reputability and credibility. So peer-reviewed information is one of the key things you're looking for. Now, the peer review system basically means that it's more than just one person posting their opinions and ideas or beliefs, but rather that there's other experts who are assessing the information as well. And where that is, peer review means that you have multiple persons agreeing at least that something is scholastic enough and reputable enough or credible enough to actually make the argument. So you want to look for peer-reviewed. Essentially, you want to see if whether or not the thing that's published has been edited. There's editors and so on and so forth. So that's a really important thing to look for on the internet. Typically, blog posts are a terrible place to find information, so you want to avoid that really at all cost. Don't cite blogs. Unless you're writing a paper on Peter Singer and you cite Peter Singer's blog, that seems to me to be okay. So it's not always the case, but for the most part, you want to avoid that. Okay, don't rely on a website at all unless you have some idea of the source or the sources that the website's using. So if you have no idea where they're getting their information from, don't use the source at all. So a lot of times I see this in my classes with statistics. Students will cite, 28% of people in America have a rifle or something like this. And I'll be like, where'd you get that information? They'll be like, oh, it was posted on this blog from this person. That's not good enough, right? It needs to be an impartial, reputable source. So if you think about it this way, there's really 4 questions you can ask when you're assessing something on the internet. You can ask the who's making this argument? Are they a reputable source? Are they an expert? Do they have bias? Why are they making the argument? Are they trying to make an argument about the accuracy of this idea, this claim, or are they trying to just persuade me to agree with their position? And then what are they arguing? What sources are given? And then can those sources be cross-checked? Can you find them in multiple places? So think of it, the who, why, what, cross-checked, right? Those are some of the questions you want to ask when you assess source from a website. Now the web's a great source, but you want to use it with care. And of course, if you do cite the web in your own papers, remember that each citation guide, style guide, has specific ways for handling how a citation should be entered. Okay, and that I think concludes our discussion for today. Let me move this back here. Thank you very much for watching our video on the question of citing sources and how to proceed. This has been Think for Yourself, an introduction to critical thinking. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.